To begin, we're drawing a rectangle using a 6-inch ruler and just creating about 1-inch squares, 6 of them, and creating a value scale. Remember, value is the lightness and darkness of a color. In this case, it'll be shades of gray. We'll start by using a darker, such as black, adding a little bit of water every time we move the square to the next lightest step. Water is used to make watercolor lighter. Using a smaller brush, just a little bit of water in your darkest color, your black, and you'll paint your first square. You'll see I'm testing it out on my practice paper, so I always know what I'll be putting into each square. Fill in the entire square, and then we'll add a little bit of water to this black in order to get the next step of a darker gray. Do a test. Maybe darken it a little bit so the step makes sense. Just one level down, one level lighter, and fill in the next one. Of course, you might need to leave a little bit of a gap because if the two squares were to touch each other, then there would be bleed through. And we don't want to cross-contaminate square to square. We're trying to make a step gradient going from dark to light, rather dark to the white of the paper. We'll just keep adding a little bit water to the previous gray in order to lighten it and paint the next square until we get to the end. The last square will just be the white of the paper. Since typically in watercolor we don't use white paint, we would let the white of the paper shine through for white objects and backgrounds and things. I decided that I wanted one darker square up just so we had a more accurate representation of our value scale from a black to the white of the paper. And you can see I even added a little lighter square too, just a dash of gray water, period. Remember, as we said, value is the lightness and darkness of a color, and that could be blue or red, or in our case, we did the gray black. It helps us with create form and create the illusion of depth in a painting. Let's get ready to move on to our next painting. We've got 3 brushes, roughly a small, medium, and a large, and a flat. We're going to be practicing what these different kinds of brushes do, the different kinds of brush strokes that you can create with different kinds of brushes. And we're using green because I'm doing a lot of leaves and green's pretty. So let's go for it. Okay, we'll start by just doing some shapes, lines, just get to know your brushes, basically. Sometimes it's nice to pick up the paper and kind of move the paint around to distribute it more evenly. Then we'll just practice some thin lines, maybe seeing how close you can get for a steady hand. I also like to notice that holding it in different directions. See how previously I was in an angle, now I'm straight up and down. Different pressure, and to see how the paint distributes. Or maybe just dipping it in, and then how many lines can you make before you run out of paint? Here we've got a stronger push that makes the brushes of the hair whiter. So you get a larger footprint sort of versus the tip. Here I'm painting a plain water wet square, and then we'll add paint into it. That's a wet on wet technique. Here I've picked up a larger brush, just seeing how much paint you can hold in your brush. That's a pretty important thing to get to know with a particular brush you have. How much water can it hold? Water meaning how much watercolor. And that'll help you understand how much painting you can get done before you run out of paint. And here I'm just trying different pressures. Pressing it makes the brushes wider, lighter touches with just the tip fill in the paint in the areas in different ways. And also the kind of brush strokes you make can make shapes like those look like leaf shapes, and just that pressing to make that leaf shape could be a valuable option. And then of course picking up the paper moves the paint around so it's not necessarily settling in one area. Here I've painted a leaf, and you'll see that that tiny little white area in the center, I intentionally left it open, and that would serve as a highlight on the shape. Remember, we don't use white paint in watercolor traditionally, so if you wanted a highlight or a bright white spot to show lightness, you would leave the absence of color. It's called negative painting. So just not painting that area will represent a shine of light. And then I can go back in with more paint to create a darker, shadowy area as I'm doing here. Here I added a darker green to one of our previous squares, and then I took some clean water to run over that line so it had a better transition, pulling a little light into the dark, a little dark into the light area, and using a clean brush to blend and kind of blur on top of that previously dry light green square. Continuing with our exploration of different kinds of brushes, this is a larger brush called a quill, Neptune quill. I like that brand a lot. It's also some call it a mop brush. Then we've got our typical round that we use often in watercolor. And both of these techniques, this tapping motion is called scumbling. It's nice to see what larger brushes can do versus smaller brushes because the larger ones hold more water. Here are flat, just a very small square. I'm just seeing how crisp and nice line work that we can get when we use those. And one of the best things is the ability to create those very thin lines by holding it in a 90 degree angle and only using the tip of the brush. Here I took one of the small to medium round brushes, and it just was dipped in plain water, so it's clean. And I'm running it along the edge of that leaf we did. And the leaf is probably almost dry, too dry, but this rubbing of clean water with the brush on the edge of it softens the edge there versus hard versus soft edges in watercolors. And you can just run a wet brush. The paint is dry enough that there won't be a great bleed. Of course, if the paint was less dry, there'll be a variation. Maybe if you wanted a little bit of a bleed, it would just be softer. But if it is a completely dried leaf and then you ran a clean brush over it, you would soften the edges. We're going to jump right into our next project. Here you can see we'll be working on a sphere, creating value and form. I'm showing you here a modified version of the value scale. Remember, we did it earlier with the ruler, and here all I've done is a dark purple and then got my brush wet and just running it down, adding water so that you can see a way to have a transition and the gradient of dark to light be a little smoother versus the squares were very organized and hard. This is just a softer version. And that's important because we want our sphere to have a gradual transition of light to dark. And we'll do that by layering and controlling how we use the water to soften between those. Here I'm adding a little dark on top of a wet area. And I'll wash the brush. Always testing. Here we've got a medium color, just a little bit lighter, but it's all just wet on wet working. And then I wipe the brush off on a paper towel and I work that medium color paint into the lighter paint. So that dark, medium, light, all wet on wet, just working to create a transitional scale. Here I'm just getting a few colors of purple ready, rather a few values of purple. So a darker, a medium, a lighter. We can change as we go along by adding more water, but it's good to start with a set of paint ready to go. In my watercolor journal, I did draw a circle. I think I used the top of a paint lid, some round object, and just traced it with a pencil. It doesn't have to be a perfect circle, but just have a circle drawn on your paper very lightly and make a few values of your chosen color. I'll be starting with a wet on wet circle. So this is just clean water painted in the entire circle. So I've decided that the light source is going to be on the top right. So those will be the lighter area of my circle, and the darker areas of my soon-to-be sphere will be the bottom left. Remember, a circle is 2D, a sphere is 3D, and we use value to create the three-dimensionality. Value creates form, and value is the lightness and darkness of a color. Here it's purple. So we start light to dark typically in watercolor. So I just did a wash on 2/3 of the sphere with the lighter purple, left that clear area where I didn't paint for my highlight. Then I added in the next layer right on top of it because we're doing wet on wet. So added a medium purple on top, leaving some of the light purple and still keeping the white white. And you pick up the book and just move things around and find a little mix there. Just added another layer of dark, and now I'll take a clean brush or a lighter color to use to bridge the gap, to kind of bring the dark into the light and the light into the dark, to help transition the colors so that it's not such a harsh blend, such a hard line. Time to add your cast shadow. This is going to be the darkest area of your sphere. The cast shadow is the shadow that the object itself casts. So if you think of this as an actual, like a bouncy ball, and there was a light bulb shining at the top right, the light is shining and glaring. That's the white area. But then behind and around the ball, it's going to be very dark. So we'll have our darkest purple. I think I added a dash of blue to make it even darker. We'll pull that on the bottom. I would highly recommend you take some objects and put some lamp light on them just to see what the different cast shadows look like. We're using purple because we're doing a value, but the cast shadow would be the color of your table. If you have a blue tablecloth with a orange piece of fruit sitting on the table and a lamp on it, your fruit is orange, but the cast shadow is going to be blue since your tablecloth is blue. A lot of times if you're using a white table and you shine the light on the object, the cast shadow is then most likely gray because the table was white. With your cast shadow, it's going to be the darkest, closest to the object, and you can see as I'm painting, I'm lightening it because as you get farther away from the object, it lightens a bit. So you'll have that transition to deal with as well. And the shape of the cast shadow, the thing with this is that we're making all this up. I don't have a sphere in front of me. I'm really just teaching you how to use paint here and basic light and dark principles. But this is the cast shadow, the shape of it is going to be dictated by the shape of your object and where you have the light, how close the lamp is, is the lamp on the very top of the object. Play with that kind of thing so you can get an idea to understand how cast shadows work. Here we're just working from imagination. We're understanding paint. But please use real life as a guide to learn these things. Here I've taken a little bit of paint. I'm just making that directly under the sphere a little bit darker with another layer of dark right on top. Here I'm taking that flat brush that has that very thin, crispy line when it's being held in 90 degrees. I actually removed a little bit of paint and you'll see it later on. That tiny thin strip of white, that's actually a bit of reflected light. Light tends to bounce around, and so when you've got the bottom of spheres and the bottom of objects can have a bounce back from the table. So I just went ahead and added that in.